Hello everyone, welcome to the third video for chapter 21. In this one we're going to be talking about the changing attitudes and values from the late industrial revolution. So the industrial era wasn't just about changing technology and the growth of cities. There was also a tremendous upheaval in the social classes and how people viewed society, both in terms of gender and race. So let's start off by discussing how you have a new social order. And this emerges by the end of the 1800s. Now, medieval society was broken up into two basic groups, right? You had nobles who owned all the land and they controlled everything, and then you had the peasants who worked the land. Now, there was always a middle class of merchants and artisans, but it was also very, very small. Now, after industrialization, you have three very distinct social classes. So again, you look at the European feudal society, king, nobles, knights. They were all part of the nobility, and then peasants made up more or less everything else. Now in the industrial era, you've got upper class, you've got a middle class, and a working class. And the middle class in particular is the one to really focus on here. The upper class, they owned the industrial businesses and they were marrying into the old aristocratic landowning families, right? So there's a lot of similarities between this. The peasants, the working class, there was a lot of similarities between them being at the bottom and so forth. But it was this middle class. They were growing, and they worked in management positions in the businesses, and they also held professional jobs like doctors and lawyers. They lived very comfortable lives, but not as luxurious as the upper class. And as I mentioned, at the bottom, you had the working class really just struggling to get by. Now, the lower class still made up the largest portion of the population, but by the 1900s, it was shrinking as the middle class grew. So this social pyramid that you see, let me just erase this. This is now starting to become a social diamond where you've got the rich controlling the small amounts, the poor with basically little, but now they're making up less, and the middle class, your tax base. This is now kind of your more modern model for society and what it should be. A strong, growing middle class is viewed as being a strong society. Now, with this middle class, you start to see this reiterate in middle class values. A major priority of the middle class became keeping up with the upper class. And they tried to dress very nicely in order to kind of be like the old school aristocrats. They had very strict codes of dress. They had strict rules of how to act. They tried to copy aspects of the upper class life, such as having servants, right? They couldn't have tons of servants, but middle class families were expected to at least have a maid or a nanny. There was also a huge priority, especially among the middle class, of creating the ideal home, right? The perfect home life. And much of this center around the roles of both husband and wife. Let me just erase this. Okay, you see the husband standing here kind of viewing everything, not looking like he's some evil tyrant, but just still kind of stern, overseeing everything, whereas the mother is sitting amongst the kids, very, very nice home. You know, the kids are dressed very properly and so forth. Among this ideal home, the husband was expected to be successful. He was expected to be successful enough that the woman did not have to work. Middle class and obviously upper class women, they were not expected to work. They were expected to stay home. And because middle class women spent so much time focusing on the home, a phenomenon called the cult of domesticity emerged. Right? You look at the first part of this, domestic, within the house. Right? This cult was about worshiping the perfect household, like you see here, with the kids dressed all well, and the kids were expected to be respectful and well behaved. The house was always in perfect order. And as I said, this all revolved around the wife. You see the woman here, dressed in the fancy clothes, but still mending the clothes, okay, still attending to the role of mother and wife. Now, for working class women, none of this stuff applied because working class women still had to work in order for the family to survive. Now, women in the workplace began leading to a movement for more women's rights. A major social and political cause for women was the temperance movement. Temperance movement sought to limit or ban the sale and use of alcohol. Now, especially among the working class, alcohol was seen as destructive to the family. It was true that alcohol abuse among working class men was very high as they sought to escape from their really miserable and tough daily existence. But this led to an awful lot of dysfunction in the family. Now, the problem with making progress with temperance or any other type of political movement is that women didn't have much support in government because they didn't have the right to vote. This, in turn, led to women's suffrage. Again, suffrage makes sure the right to vote. Groups advocating for women gaining the right to vote emerged in Europe and the U.S. in the late 1800s, but the odds were always stacked against them. There were a lot of arguments against women's suffrage. Okay, you see actual organizations started to oppose women's suffrage. Among the arguments against them were that they were too emotional to handle voting, that women needed to be protected from the rough world of politics, and that a woman's place was traditionally in the home and not out in society. And these were things that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. All right, public education. By the late 1800s, some governments in Europe were establishing public schools. This came about due to industrial society. Industrialization, kind of the method of mass production, that eventually was being translated into education as well. There was also a need to teach these kids. Industrialization created a need for more literate society. With more kind of technical jobs and so forth. Now, early industrial education was very, very poor. They always focused on the 3 R's, right? That was basically all they focused on: reading, writing, arithmetic. Just the basics. So, basically they were doing it just to kind of take time out of the day for these kids. A big reason why is because, children, they weren't needed to work on the farms anymore because they were living in the cities. And with child labor laws, all right, I'll come back to that one in a second. Now, younger children literally had nothing to do. These kids that were working in the factories before, they were working in the mines. It was illegal for kids 7, 8, 9 years old to be doing that. So you had to find something for them to do. So eventually they went to school. And this led to some improvements in industrial education. So you went from this more to this by the early 1900s. Still a far cry from kind of our more modern models. But, the basics of kids sitting in desks and rows and the blackboards and so forth, that goes back, 150 years. All right. Plus, this became a priority for the middle class, right? The middle class, it looked at education as a way for them to improve your standing in society, like we just talked about on the previous slide. Now, governments looked at public education as a way to not only educate the society, but also to create better citizens. And this is something that we still do today. What does every public school and even most private schools do at the beginning of the day, right? You see the little kids here. They're reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Public schools are an extension of the government, and they're a way to create a better citizenry. All right, so it's not just about teaching the 3 R's. It's also about creating better public servants as well. Now, this was all for primary schools. You notice the pictures I showed you, and even this one here, for the little kids. Now, what happens when you get to secondary schools? Where secondary schools really remain mostly for the upper and the middle classes. The working class would typically attend school from about 11 to 12 years of age, and then they'd go back into the workforce. High schools, universities, they were really only for the families that didn't need to have their kids work. Obviously, colleges cost money, so that was really only for the upper class. Now, one thing you notice at the picture here, all the people in it, guys. Right? For the most part, even among the upper and middle classes, secondary school was only for the males. Very few girls went to secondary school. But by the late 1800s, you did have some all-female colleges emerge, such as Mount Holyoke in the United States, where this picture in about 1907 was taken from. But it was still largely believed that women did not need to be educated. All right, changes in science. Now, we talked in previous sections about how science changed the workplace and as well as how we lived. It also began changing how we viewed ourselves as humans. This thing called atomic theory starts to come around in the late 1800s. It states that all matter, everything that makes up everything in the world, is made up of these tiny particles called atoms. That's a big revolutionary concept compared to how we always viewed the world throughout human history. Additionally, geology. Right? Basically, studying of rocks and so forth, but much more importantly, it used science to show that the Earth is way older than previously thought. Right? It comes out that the Earth is now billions of years old, and they do this by carbon dating rocks and so forth. Now, the belief that the Earth is billions of years old, that's at odds with the Bible. And this creates an interesting conflict between religion and science. And this conflict was later embodied by this guy called Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin was a British naturalist, meaning he studied nature. And based on his studies of a bunch of different animal species, in 1859, he published a book called The Origin of the Species. And he developed the theory of natural selection, meaning that the animals and plants that are best suited to survive will. This is better known by the saying, survival of the fittest. Now, this in and of itself wasn't too radical, but it was Darwin's assertion that plants and animals evolve over millions of years to survive that became a problem, right? That we evolved from lower primates, that were much more similar to apes, such as chimpanzees and gorillas. This put him at big-time odds with the church. All right, his theory of evolution was contrary to creationism, right? That God created Adam and Eve. Let me just move me out of the way here. Okay, you see that from Michelangelo's the Sistine Chapel. Okay, God bestowing life upon Adam. These two things do not match up well together, so this was going to lead to years of debate between science and religion, and it's not fully settled to this day. Now, Darwin's teachings were used in a way he definitely did not intend, with this thing called social Darwinism. Just move me back down. Some social theorists used Darwin's teachings of survival of the fittest, and they applied it to natural selection, or I should say they applied natural selection to society. They stated that some individuals, such as business owners, right, these big, industrial tycoons, the reason they were more successful is because they were more, quote unquote, fit to survive than the lowly workers and the working class and so forth. Now, this kind of idea that the upper class is better than the lower class had been around for centuries, right? Aristocrats going back, thousands of years were believed to be better than the peasantry and the commoners. But a difference with social Darwinism was that it was used to justify and actually encourage racism. Now, racism is an unscientific belief, and that unscientific part is important, right? There's never been anything that's been accepted by the scientific community to show that one race is better than the other. But it's a belief that a race is superior to another race, and then, conversely, that a race would be inferior to another one. And racists used the industrial power of Europe and the United States to show that whites were superior to non-industrialized world, namely Africa and Asia. Now, as I said, there is no true scientific basis for it, but the fact that countries such as Great Britain and Germany and the United States, and the U.S. was still predominantly a white country at this point in the late 1800s, it was used by them to back up their claims of white superiority. And we'll talk more about this in a later chapter when we get to imperialism, because they would use social Darwinism to justify the European conquest of Africa and Asia and places like that. All right, so that wraps it up for how you saw some changes in society and so forth. And then in the next and last section in this chapter, we will talk about some changes in the arts.